the day. I am delighted to introduce a big supporter of Bioenergy Australia, Tiana Nairn, who is the Group Manager of Policy for LMS Energy. LMS have been members of Bioenergy Australia for quite some time, and they have been strong participants across our Renewable Gas Alliance and other activities. So we are delighted to have you on board for this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shahana, and thank you to Shahana and her team for putting together another fabulous conference with so much information and great flow. So I'll just get my slides started. I'm here as gold sponsor for LMS Energy. We are a proud supporter of Bioenergy Australia and the work that they do. And what I want to show you briefly here, if I move forward, is some of you will have seen me stand up here before around LMS being a leading methane abatement from waste company. This year's slide shows us having more projects again and continuing to have Australian in-house engineering and design, construction and operation, and now nearly 300 employees. Through this growth and continuing to improve the methane abatement at landfills across the country, we're now saving over 5 million tonnes of carbon abatement per year, and in total we've now saved over 50. So again, new records for us, and look at what that is equivalent to. These are significant outcomes. And when you look at that in the near term, those impacts become even more important, because when we look at a 10 to 20 year period, methane's impact as a short-lived gas is even more significant. It becomes the strongest lever we have to slow climate change over the next 25 years, to build time for a lot of the renewable fuels that we've been talking about so far, and the biomethane to come, and the other hard-to-abate sector activity we need to do. So it's a small gas, but it's equivalent in its warming potential over the next 10 years to all of the carbon emissions. We have three key sectors of emissions in Australia. They are waste, agriculture and the resources sector. And what we seek to do through LMS is ensure that we are making the most of our organic matter across the range of sectors, improving how we manage waste, running on renewable energy, reducing carbon emissions, and also supporting the health and productivity of our land. Whether waste is suitable for resource recovery, in which case we see it going through to anaerobic digestion, or if it is contaminated, going to landfill, where we capture and abate the methane from it, providing valuable renewable energy. How we do this, many of you will have seen this slide previously, but as waste is in landfill, it breaks down naturally and produces biogas, which is half methane. We capture that under negative pressure throughout the landfills and then direct it into bioenergy facilities or flare it to destroy it. We then sell all the carbon and electricity products from it to our customers. So we don't own or operate any landfills. We manage Australia's waste for them, reducing emissions from everyone's consumption patterns. And Australia is doing this really, really well. This conference is about the policy we need in these spaces. When it comes to emissions from solid waste, the schemes that we have, particularly the carbon credit scheme, are resulting in us being one of the world's leaders in it. Now at LMS, we direct the biogas that we capture to electricity, and we have the largest contracted biogas reserves in the country through to 2040, substantial volumes. And across the east coast of Australia, we see multiple opportunities to direct a range of that gas to be upgraded into biomethane. And anyone who would like to speak further about that, I'll direct them to myself or Jared separately. Where waste is suitable for recovery, we are investing significantly in that as well. We provide the heat and power services for a large food waste AD plant in New Zealand. We have invented our own anaerobic digestion system, piloted now in South Australia for our type of food and garden organic collection systems. We're moving towards developing a full-scale AD plant in Victoria, and I'm very pleased that In Casino in northern New South Wales, we are proceeding with our first agricultural AD project. And we see substantial further opportunities. So again, these are our current ones that I can speak to. We have more preliminary side of things, working with our wholly owned subsidiary, Helmont Energy. But what we see there is biogas has the potential for biomethane. It also, there you'll see biodiesel and SAF projects. Like many in this room, what we see is that policy matters. Policy is driving significant biomethane development in the US, and through that, we are now investing in a biomethane plant in Florida, where one of our large landfills is. What we see is the need to continue to have harmonised carbon, energy and waste policy, and that renewable fuel and gas policy could be a key driver for making better use of all of our organic materials. Thank you. I'm now pleased to introduce our speakers for this session, and I would like to announce that we'll be having Emily Marthaler, Director of Global Policy, Growth and Energy, and then Anita Kapernick, Assistant Director, Net Zero Industries Division, Guarantee of Origin and Trade from the Australian Government's Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. Then Tim Lloyd-Smith, regarding the Future Energy Study Leader of GHD. And finally, Steve Tan, Vice President, Business Development, Argus Media. There are a couple of us with flights immediately after this, so we will keep the session tight and seek to hold our questions a little bit shorter. And if you see me packing up a banner at the end, I'll be running too. Thanks all. Please welcome Emily.
Thank you, Tiana, and thanks again to Bioenergy Australia for having me here. And thank you also for not kicking me off this panel after yesterday. I'm always excited when I didn't do too bad. So I know we're excited to talk about ethanol again, but actually to bring it down a notch of my enthusiasm, since this is a panel on accountability or carbon accounting, traceability, and certification, my slides are going to be talking more about the exciting world of carbon accounting. So I'm going to try and use as much enthusiasm as I can, and you already know about growth. And so I have a little excess slides here, I think, so I'll be fast forwarding a bit because now you know all about it. But I think is what a lot of the other speakers had talked about is that a lot of countries have different national targets for SAF, and you can see them up here, but everyone has nicer slides than I do sometimes. But the one thing I wanted to note for a lot of these and going forward too is a lot of this conversation is on carbon accounting, net zero. What's your life cycle analysis score? How are you related into your reductions? So a big part of that is going to have to be carbon accounting. So if you're going to say, for instance, I'm going to have a 10%, I'm looking at all volumetrics at the moment, but if you're starting to look at things like I want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, you have to be able to measure that and do it accordingly. Now, in addition to all of these different countries' greenhouse gas emissions reductions or SAF productions, I think we've heard a few times throughout the past few days on ICAO CORSIA, and I never get it right, so I'm glad I have it on the slide, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization's carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. I never get that right. I don't know why. But in addition to those countries, ICAO CORSIA also has a requirement in the international sphere. And as you see by this graph, CORSIA is aiming to keep international aviation, so this is just international aviation, carbon neutral from going forward, which would be not just carbon neutral, but also a 15% reduction from the 2019 baseline, with the idea of using carbon or using CORSIA eligible fuels, which are essentially low carbon fuels, or other types of technology improvements operationally or aircraft. So that is a very, very ambitious goal given the amount for international aircraft. But what does that really mean? Because you can talk about a goal all you want. And so the real elements of ICAO CORSIA is that it is supposed to be, again, 15% reduction from the 2019 baseline with a 10% greenhouse gas emissions reduction for CORSIA eligible fuels. So if you want to have a fuel that will meet this, such as SAF, that SAF has to have at least a 10% reduction. And this is where it gets really fun with CORSIA, is that it actually has a different way of determining your LCA, your carbon intensity. It actually combines 2 models for your core LCA, and then it's added to 2 additional models for your ILUC, and together that becomes your score. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And it actually is, I have a lot of opinions on ICAO CORSIA, but essentially there you go. That's how you get your score with ICAO, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of those issues. But it cannot also be cannot be combined with other SAF reduction schemes. So if you have a national-based one, it has to be separate than the CORSIA one. It covers, again, all international flights, and 129 countries have agreed to participate in CORSIA, and that includes Australia and the United States and a bunch of others. And even though the country signed up, the obligated party will be the airline. And we're starting in we're in the first phase right now of ICAO CORSIA, which is voluntary for determining your calculations and offsets. But the second phase, from starting in 2027, actually requires this offset, and it requires this carbon neutrality. So even for Australia, where a lot of people talk about we don't have an actual a SAF goal or target. Yes, you do. It's in ICAO CORSIA, so your international flights will have to be compliant with CORSIA. And let's be honest, it's an international guideline, so it doesn't have the same teeth as a pure country-based requirement, but that is what's currently there. And so CORSIA is getting a lot of international interest in how it's done. The LCA, they like to talk about how, in and of itself, CORSIA is agreed to by lots of countries within it. Okay, we're going to skip this because it's the end of the day. And so what that really means is that over time, as you see for SAF-eligible fuels, a massive ramp up on the need for SAF. It's kind of exponential. So what that means is 132.5 billion liters of SAF will be required every year to be compliant, not just with CORSIA, but also the various individual requirements as well. And so, what that means. So for the United States, in addition to CORSIA, we also have our Inflation Reduction Act, which does provide a very significant tax credit for the production of SAF. And within this context of LCAs, we've learned quite a bit, and I wanted to kind of share things that we've learned within it. So if Australia does develop something, it might be of interest. But the first one really is flexibility, and that's kind of the name of the game, I think. Having a very strict requirement on LCAs and having ILUC, everyone wants to talk about ILUC, or using certain things such as what LCA, what are those parameters. That flexibility will be key to have really any successful policy. And not to say that ours is successful, because that's still to be determined, but we are starting to see some benefits there, but also some things that are challenges. The other thing would be stackable credits. So obviously, if there's a federal tax credit, being able to use that and other credits that are in the states, that helps even further to provide more financial certainty and more support. For a lot of times, as you've seen in other speakers before, SAF is very expensive. So providing that added financial benefit there. And here we come back to the 2 models. So this is partially my dislike for CORSIA. But in order to be eligible for our tax credits, you have to have a 50% reduction. And you can use that via 2 models, ICAO CORSIA, or the U.S. Department of Energy's Argonne National Laboratories GREET model. So I hear a few speakers have talked about that before. So 2 things on that kind of topic here. The 50% reduction, one thing I wanted to kind of reference here is to be careful on specific values. And you'll see in a future slide, we say 50% reduction. So some questions as you develop a policy or think about a policy, is it 50%? Is it 49.5% in rounding? Because we've literally had lots of conversation recently on rounding, and can you round up to 50%? So keep that in mind as you kind of develop it. Does 50 mean 50? And similarly, if you are rounding, for instance, does 49.4% of a reduction not get the tax credit? So I think that's really one question you have to think about, is how much leeway do you want to provide within that determination? Because if you think about it, 49.4% is pretty darn good. So how do you kind of work that? And partially, the reason why it's important is you talk about risk, as you talk about investment, you really need to start looking at if you're going to invest in a feedstock production for SAF, and you're only going to get 49.4%, but you're thinking you could get 49.8, it's really going to have a big role in terms of risk. So just throwing that out there. And the other two, on the two models perspective, what I wanted to reference is we don't do too well under ICAO CORSIA for U.S. corn. Very bad, for instance. But also kind of what we've heard about from other speakers today, ICAO CORSIA or other international discussions don't really take into account what Australia has, what Australia's farming situation's like, what Australia's energy situation's like. It doesn't really incorporate a lot of those factors. So we have found, relative to the benefit and success here and what we talk about in other countries, is having two alternative models. Yes, if you want to use ICAO CORSIA, but having a secondary model. So for us in the US, GREET is definitely that model. So for Australia, great, you could use GREET, but having another model so that whatever kind of development for alternative or advanced fuels in Australia will be able to meet Australia's goals using Australia's framework. And having that flexibility would really help those producers as well. The other thing I wanted to talk about was climate smart agriculture is something that the US has used a little bit. And really what that means, and I think some of the previous conversation points have really talked about this idea of getting farmers to get landowners to be involved. And I think that's something that generally in the US, biofuels have really gotten the support of farmers. I think it's really looked at in a different, perhaps in a different light, in the sense of, or trying to get success for it anyways. Instead of farmers, instead of agriculture being part of the emissions that you have to fix, thinking of them as the solution. Most farmers are, they own the land, they've had that land for generations. It is their heritage, and they want to pass it on. They view themselves as stewards of the land. So within that context, really looking at ways that they can be a part of the solution in addition to, of course, just providing the fuel. How can you use ways that would encourage things like no-till farming? How do you crop rotation? How do you kind of encourage these practices which are very helpful for these farmers? And I think that mindset is really going to be helpful too. And so also on that note, when you talk about different integration of how do we develop SAF policy, one also would be referenced that it would be really helpful to have a lot of agriculture at your table, having more than just one or two, because it really is a very interesting topic. And kind of on that note, I wanted to reference, and most of these slides are on carbon accounting or modeling, but that also goes back to traceability. In the US, and I'm assuming with Australia and most farmers, having that kind of trace back to a farm is very concerning. So if you want to kind of go back in time, you really have to work with those farmers. And keep in mind, we've heard from various speakers who talk about business that a lot of the slides and the information are proprietary, don't share it. And that's similar to farmers. So they view that their data, what they do on their land, is also proprietary in the sense of they don't want it to kind of be out there and be criticized in that same way. The other thing I wanted to note on this slide, I'm spending a lot on this time, the slide, but again, also having feedstock agnostic. Of course, I love corn ethanol, and I think it's great. When you set up a policy, make sure that it kind of is open-ended, because it is such a new industry out there that you don't want to kind of pick losers and winners, or winners and losers, too soon within those topic discussions. I think, yes, okay, I think that's my wrap on this slide, if you will. There we go. And so kind of going back now to what I mentioned within CORSIA and within GREET model. So here's GREET recently released their version for 45Z, which is the tax credit for SAF in the United States. And when you say 45Z GREET, GREET is used in different platforms. And so that always kind of has a different name. So this is 45Z GREET. And these are general numbers relative to a US farm. We entered this data ourselves to kind of see where a general corn farmer would be. And as you can see, we're under that threshold for 50%. So this farm, or this scenario, a farmer would be able to meet those tax credits for SAF using corn ethanol. And similarly, carbon sequestration used in this scenario, it's the same one as before, but again using CCS, and that would also, as you see, a larger reduction relative to them also getting the 45Z tax credit using GREET, which is great. So GREET is going to be helpful, and we can utilize GREET for our farmers. On CORSIA, it's different. CORSIA says corn ethanol is worse than gasoline, which kind of hurts a little bit. And these are old or current numbers. They should be revised the next couple of months, I believe. And it'll get better for corn ethanol. So corn ethanol is that second column. You see petroleum jet, so jet fuel A. It's not great. And primarily, as you heard from before, is this ILOC value. You know, unfortunately for CORSIA, it's not very scientific in how they come about it. They use multiple models and they average them together. And in some instances, if the models themselves are too far apart, they take the lower model and literally add like 6. It's a whole thing just to get things done. So I don't want to say it too much of a criticism, though I'm happy to criticize CORSIA. I reference it more on the lines that why it's important to have models that work for you. We are trying to improve CORSIA. It's very difficult. I'm not going to hold my breath on that. So I just kind of use it as an emphasis for Australia to remember that if you want to help your own country's biofuels, make sure something works for you, and it's not necessarily going to be what is out there internationally with CORSIA. And even with CCS, we're still not going to meet that 50% reduction. And so this is why I just kind of emphasize it so we can meet our own. I know a few of a lot of this has been more focused on SAF or marine or the other exciting world, I really find it exciting, of renewable diesel. But I wanted to kind of emphasize the on-road bit a little bit more too. You know, in the talk, some of the previous speakers talked about risk and de-risking SAF through various feedstocks. One way is to utilize an attempt to decarbonize your land or your light-duty fleet. Could also help with some of that de-risk, right? So if you want to de-risk, you could develop technology today that can help both your on-road as well as with SAF, such as the exciting world of ethanol. But there are other fuels, biodiesel, renewable diesel as well. And as you can see from this slide, the internal combustion engine will be around for a very long time. And as we heard from the last panel as well, EVs do have a bit of a holdback just because the tailpipe emissions may be 0. They do have a lot of other emissions built in. So just saying it based on the tailpipe doesn't necessarily help. Ethanol's doing great, by the way. And so I just wanted to reference these slides on corn because I think this kind of emphasizes the need for modeling to be dynamic, to be flexible, right? So initially in U.S. ethanol, of course it's corn. Our farmers are actually, I wrote this down because I always mess it up a little bit, but we're producing more ethanol from 1 bushel of corn, more bushels per acre on less land with less inputs. And you can actually see this. So this is the corn yield. So this is how much corn we're getting per acre, and it's steadily increasing over time. And we do anticipate it, or I should say the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I'm no longer working with them, they do anticipate yields continuing to increase. As well as our ethanol plants are getting more efficient, so we're also producing more ethanol. And so really the basis I say this for is that no matter what feedstock, right? So this was corn, or this is corn, but you can put it for any agricultural-based feedstock. It continues to improve its efficiency over time. So when you do look at biofuels feedstocks, make sure you look at it from an agricultural perspective too. And so you do see over time that reduction of a carbon intensity for corn ethanol over time, and even further going forward, you have in the green column, of course, using CCS or other kinds of production for ethanol. But then on the right-hand side in the yellow, you see that just farming practices themselves can have a significant decrease and actually go to negative emissions over time. And so I just wanted to highlight that because as you start to look at things like modeling, the exciting world of modeling, having flexibility, having this kind of awareness is something that we really push for our corn ethanol, but also for any kind of feedstock Australia wants to do, and it could be whatever it is having those leniencies as well. So I think that is it for me on the exciting world of ethanol. So thank you so much.
I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to elders, both past and present. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today, Shahana and team. In the lead up to it, I've been thinking a bit about the first time I spoke to industry representing government nearly 20 years ago. My colleague was talking about environmental licensing regulations and increases in costs, and was introduced by the MC as the stick, while I, speaking about an industry development program, was introduced not as the carrot but the cupcake. I've never really been sure whether I was the cupcake or the industry support program was the cupcake, but it was nice to know that it was warmly regarded either way. And here I am today talking about another industry, another program to support Australian industry, the Guarantee of Origin scheme. Oops. So the Australian government is developing a voluntary Guarantee of Origin scheme, the GO scheme, to track and verify the emissions associated with low carbon products and to provide an enduring mechanism to certify renewable electricity. Development of the scheme commenced back in 2020, and over the past 5 years, the government has consulted extensively, both domestically and internationally, to develop a robust scheme that's both practical for Australian products and producers and is also aligned with requirements in international export markets. The GO scheme will provide the emissions accounting backbone to support the development of Australia's net zero industries. It will help our producers remain competitive in emerging domestic and international markets. The scheme also supports the government's Future Made in Australia plan, which is about attracting and enabling investment in low carbon products and renewable electricity in order to leverage the economic benefits of the global move towards net zero. In November last year, the legislation for the scheme passed through both houses of Parliament and received royal assent. The package comprises 3 acts. The primary legislation is the Future Made in Australia Guarantee of Origin Act 2024. There are 2 other acts, one providing transitional and consequential amendments to other legislation, and one enabling cost recovery of the scheme. So the legislation jointly establishes the framework for the GO scheme and provides objectives that will ensure a transparent and robust scheme that enables decarbonisation and the access to low carbon markets. This GO scheme is expected to commence in the second half of this year, 2025. So what are the key elements in the legislation? So the Act manages matters like registering of people and facilities to the scheme. It also provides the framework for the certification of the emissions intensity of products and renewable electricity. It also includes a range of matters that must be considered in developing the emissions accounting methodologies for those products. The information of the certificates must be published online and accessible publicly. And it also provides for a variety of ways to maintain the integrity of the scheme through audits, compliance and enforcement. Of course, the Act doesn't operate in isolation. The Acts provide the overarching framework, and the detail will be included in a range of subordinate legislation that we've been working hard on. And we'll be consulting on all of these pieces of legislation that you can see up there. And I'll talk a little bit about that consultation shortly. So what does all this legislation do? The GO scheme will provide 2 types of digital certificates once it commences. The Renewable Energy GO certificate that we call the REGO. Those certificates provide information on when, where and how renewable electricity is produced. And the Product GO, or PGO, certificates will allow producers, exporters and users to prove where a product was made, how it was made, and the emissions associated with the production, transport, and storage of the product. The PEGO certificates will track the emissions of a product to the point of its delivery to a consumer within Australia or to a point of export. The PEGO certificates can also accommodate situations where certified product is blended with non-certified products through shared infrastructure, such as a gas network, a pipeline, or storage tanks. A GO certificate will give producers and consumers greater confidence in making claims about and purchasing decisions based on the emissions intensity of the products. The certificates will be available in a public register that will be maintained by the Clean Energy Regulator. So let's have a look at what emissions are being accounted for. So the PEGO certificates will capture emissions from across a product's life cycle and provide an emissions intensity per unit of product produced. Essentially, the emissions represent the sum of upstream emissions, capturing inputs and feedstock, production emissions, the direct emissions from the production process, as well as post-production emissions, capturing storage, transport, and delivery of the product. It also accounts for any losses to the product across those activities. Emissions from consumption, use, or disposal of a product are excluded. The scheme has been developed to align with international emissions accounting frameworks for low emission products, and this will enable scheme participants to access the emerging global markets. So the GO scheme will provide us a foundation. By providing robust and transparent emissions intensity certification, the GO scheme will be the foundation to support other zero emission initiatives. So the government's Future Made in Australia program includes funding for production incentives through schemes like the Hydrogen Production Tax Incentive, the Green Aluminium Production Credit, and the recently announced Green Iron Fund. So the PEGO certificates will provide authentication of the emissions intensity of the products produced through these programs. This will ensure these investments are delivering real emissions reductions. So last year, the government committed to fast-tracking commencement of the GO scheme and also expanding it to other commodities, including green metals, low-carbon liquid fuels, and biomethane. Commencing in the second half of this year, the GO scheme will initially certify the emissions intensity of hydrogen produced through electrolysis. And now we've kicked off the policy work needed to apply the GO scheme to low-carbon liquid fuels and biomethane. And green metals, but we're not here today to talk about green metals. And in the first half of this year, we'll be releasing several discussion papers and be looking forward to talking to all of you guys and hearing your views and ideas on how we can best approach using the GO scheme framework to these low-carbon liquid fuels and biomethane frameworks. And we're also really keen to hear from you now in relation to the draft Guarantee of Origin rules. So in case you missed it, last week we released an exposure draft of the GO rules. The rules are the first tranche of the suite of GO subordinate legislation that will support the Act. The draft rules address a range of topics central to the broad operation of the GO scheme. This means that they'll apply across all products, and we're really keen to get your views on them. So in the lead up to the scheme commencement, we'll also consult on other forms of subordinate legislation. Importantly, this will include the methodology for our first GO product, hydrogen production through electrolysis. So how can you get involved? You can scan that QR code and it will take you to the draft GO rules, or you can visit this website. We'll have consultation open for 4 weeks. It'll be closing on, I think it's the 27th of March, but please double check that. And the rules, as I said, will apply across all of the products. So even if you're not in hydrogen, please have a look and let us know what you think. So I appreciate this has been a pretty, back one. A pretty fast overview of the Go scheme, and most of you, if not all of you, will have more questions on how it will work for you and your businesses, and we're keen to talk to you and learn from you, and we want to make it a good scheme. So please reach out to us, and that QR code will take you to our website where you can learn a bit more or find our email if you lose it today. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita, and I think I almost had a false start there. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Lloyd-Smith, and I am the Future Study Lead at GHD. Today I'm actually going to be discussing potential strategies for mitigating the green premium. And I'm actually going to be taking quite a slightly contrarian view of this, and I'm actually going to be looking a bit beyond fuels. So bear with me, because I do know we are talking about fuels in this, I suppose, conference, but there's some good reasons why I'm going to do that. But before I get started, I would like to pay I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners upon the lands in which we meet, the Gadigal people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I also have a disclaimer. You saw this on Steve's. Just basically, these are my opinions. They do not represent GHD's opinions. Any errors or omissions are my own. So, to get started, I think it's worth us just thinking and reflecting on what is the status quo of, I suppose, absorbing the green premium. And I liked what Anita just mentioned before, cupcakes. So we have cupcakes, we have carrots, we have sticks. They are the regulatory mechanisms that we are all used to, and that in many ways we're trying to expect to, I suppose, to be able to mitigate the green premium. We also have what I would call, I suppose, bullish corporate behaviour, which is where we're trying to pursue large economies of scale, or large scales to achieve economies of scale. But I think the challenge we have this is that they're subject to change. They are political change, a political cycle, so I'm going to call that the Trump factor. That can obviously affect things. And then there is the market factor. So we might even call that the Elliott management factor. So Google that in BP and you'll know what I'm referring to. So what I'm actually going to look at is consumer pass-through, where we try and actually pass through the green premium to consumers who will absorb it. So we're actually not trying to have a regulatory intervention at all, any sort of intervention. And before I get into it, I just also want to, I suppose, address some of the challenges we are facing because we are a conference talking about fuels. Fuels are hard. I'm going to say they're damn hard. I don't think we could have picked a more difficult place to try and compete. And there are a few reasons for that. Fuels are highly, highly commoditized. We're I suppose, competing with a high volume, very low margin industry. And I think one of the challenges we have is the product we're trying to sell is effectively interchangeable and indistinguishable. Now, from a consumer-facing perspective, that is a problem. It's a benefit, but it's also a hindrance because there is no distinguishing feature other than, I suppose, our environmental credentials. And the final kicker is our product's going to be more expensive, and it's almost always going to be more expensive as we scale, unless we have some sort of intervention. And I think the thing that I suppose is even more challenging for me is that the incumbent that we're competing against did not have these issues when it emerged. It started out small, it started out in a very niche area, and its product was superior. So what are the alternative strategies to potentially pass on or absorb the green premium without interventions? And these strategies I'm looking at to try and catalyse our bioeconomy. The first is, I suppose, through sensible product selection, and that could require you to pivot from fuels to something else and maybe back to fuels. The second is, I suppose, understanding and really reflecting on the importance of scale and how we can actually use scale to be our friend. And the final, I suppose, strategy, or at least consideration, is the central role of consumers and why we need to consider consumers at all times in this process. And I'm going to try and look at these through, I suppose, a mixture of historical examples, case studies, and some of my own ideas. So I'm going to start with looking at algae biofuels. And I think if we had this conference 10 to 15 years ago, we would have had lots of presentations on algae biofuels because it was a really hot topic. And there were a lot of people who thought it was going to completely revolutionise the industry. Now, we have had one presentation, and that was great, on this, but I think it's interesting to see this didn't really happen. So what happened to these companies? What happened to algae biofuels? As this sort of slide shows here, how am I going to use this? A lot of them pivoted. So they pivoted away from fuels. And those that didn't, some of them failed. So they either pivoted or they failed. And why did they pivot? Well, they pivoted because they could move. They moved to, I suppose, a smaller market but very high margin products. So they targeted things like nutraceuticals, beauty and cosmetic inputs, and omega-3s. And you can see this in this top corner. And whilst I suppose the original market was huge, fuels are a massive market, there's a massive addressable market, it had very, very, very tight margins. So again, without that regulatory intervention, it was basically impossible to compete. So they had to pivot. And what some of these companies actually found was if they still pursued fuels, they actually were destroying value. So they pivoted, they looked at these smaller markets, and they used them to actually help them scale their products. So they had the ability to, I suppose, monetize what they were doing and learn from it. And many of these companies still have the ambition of returning to fuels, but it's a long-term goal. And this leads me into, I suppose, my second point, which is all around scale. And it's, I suppose, around the importance of scale and the importance of sensible economies of scale. So I mentioned that we sometimes use economies of scale to justify projects. We use massive economies of scale to say, well, the economics will now work. There's another way to think about it. We can actually use smaller projects and smaller markets as a way to, I suppose, catalyse and monetize our product development. And it also gives us a chance to pilot technologies. Like, I'm an engineer, I work in technology development, and the thing that frustrates me a lot is I've got massive projects with technologies that haven't been tested, and it scares me. We need to pilot our technologies. We need to pilot them at the right scales where we can learn from them. And there's some really interesting examples of companies that have done this. So Air Company, which is it is an ESAF company, they started out by making some consumer goods, high margin consumer goods using their DAC tech. So they made vodka, they made perfume, and they made hand sanitizer. These things were basically impossible to get because they were always sold out, but they used that to generate revenue to continue their development and also allow them to test out a component of their technology, which was to make ethanol to then be converted to jet fuel. And we can even look at, say, ooh, what have I done? Sorry, that's right. We can even look at Tesla as an interesting example where they've actually got consumers to pay for their product development. I mean, the Tesla Roadster is a pretty classic example. It was not a perfect product, but they created a very aspirational product, and consumers bought, they tested, they developed. And this is something we as an industry need to think about as well in our, as we develop the bioeconomy and biofuels. And I suppose my final slide, or not final sort of point, is we really need to understand our end customers. I know we're engineers, we're not marketers, but we do need to understand this. And we need to really reflect on what customers want, what customers want versus what they're willing to pay for. And that's going to be very, very different. And it's also important that we understand consumer desires, particularly their desires for, say, a generic commodity product, which I would say fuels are, and even to an extent airline tickets are, versus an aspirational product, which I'd say is like a signalling product. That's why people buy Louis Vuitton bags. It's a bag, it costs a lot more, but it signals something. And I'd argue you may even look at things like bottled water as signalling, because, it's water. And I'm going to try and, I suppose, give you some examples of products that I think are good ways that you could potentially pass on this green premium. And that's food-grade CO2. Now, I've done some quick numbers. The industry pays less than a cent a litre for the CO2 it puts into soda. Now, consumers, so either a sustainably minded consumer or a consumer who, I suppose, is actually looking to find a cheaper source, might buy SodaStream. SodaStream sells you CO2 at $47,500 a tonne. That is a lot of money, but that only accounts for 30 or just slightly less than 30 cents a litre. Now, when we think about, I suppose, what I was talking about, these aspirational products and discriminatory pricing, water is a really great example of where we have discriminatory pricing. Why do you buy that fancy Italian water versus the water that comes out of the tap? It's because it signals something. Now, the interesting thing with that fancy Italian water is it's probably got some CO2 in it from an Italian refinery, which most people would not have thought about. So I would say that this is a really interesting example of a product and a market where you could potentially provide a green product, and the premium would be absorbed by a consumer. The next one, and I'm going to be quick because I'm really running out of time, is just a company that's doing this. So these are another sort of consumer. This is Lego. Now, Lego obviously makes very famous plastic bricks. Now, unlike fuels, which say an airline travels about 60% of the cost, the plastic cost within a Lego brick that we pay for is about 5% of the production cost. Lego is desperate to decarbonise and desperate to make their products sustainable. And because of this, they are, as you can see on these slides, they are trying to source bioplastics, and they're willing to pay a premium. They're saying 30 to 70%, but I would argue it could be potentially even more. These are the sort of customers we need to be looking at and potentially targeting as our beachhead markets, rather than fuels, which I would say are challenging. I know fuels are important, and I know it's a massive area we need to decarbonise, but I think we need to be a bit more creative at times. And that's really where I'm going to wind up. I suppose the key message I'd like you to take away is that the green premium can be absorbed without intervention, but it actually requires us to think quite creatively. We have a lot of really innovative technologies, with amazing technologies, but I think we just need to be a little bit more creative and a little bit more innovative in how we market those technologies and the products we select to use them. I get why we're targeting fuels. We need to decarbonise it, but we also need to get projects on the ground. We need to learn, we need to scale. Maybe it's worth having a look somewhere else. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Tan. I am the Business Development Lead for Energy Transition at Argus Media. And today, I'm just going to build on a little bit on what Tiana mentioned earlier with regards to biogas and generating carbon credits. I'm here to give you a bit more context around that. So my topic today is around the role of bioenergy in the Australian carbon markets. Now, before I begin, I'd like to give credit to my colleague, Huan Wei, who's our carbon editor based here in Sydney. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today, so I'm filling in for him. So during the Q&A, if there are any questions I cannot answer, I will pass them on to him. So without further ado, so whenever we talk about carbon markets, we really, sorry, let me just get the hang of this. Going back. Thank you. Cheers. Sorry, whenever we talk about carbon markets, typically we frame it into two areas. So one is what we call the compliance scheme. So these are mandatory requirements set by governments in order to achieve their specific nationally determined contributions, which is the NDCs. And typically they'll target either specific sectors or specific companies. And in the case of Australia, you'll find that under the safeguard mechanism, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, there are about 215 to 220 entities, primarily in oil and gas, heavy industry, metals and mining, and transportation, which have to reduce their carbon emissions under this scheme. Increasingly, their requirements will be increased every year by about 4.9% based on their baselines, and the rates will be set every 5-year blocks onwards. So typically this is the safeguard mechanism. In April next month, there will be a review, and we expect the entities that are affected might be reduced by about 5 to about 215 entities under the safeguard mechanism. On the flip side, we have the voluntary scheme. So ACCUs, basically the Australian Carbon Credit Units, these are markets which generate carbon credits in Australia, and one ACCU is the equivalent of 1 ton of carbon dioxide, which is either avoided or stored, issued by the government, managed by the CER, and this was actually originally generated or originally formed based on the Carbon Farming Initiative from 2011. So essentially, this is a really, really good way to look at the markets. And I think when you compare, let's say, Australia's carbon markets to those in the region, what is really unique in Australia here is the intermingling of the voluntary scheme and the compliance scheme. So if you look at other countries, like in China, Korea, or even Singapore, there's a cap of about 5% in the amount of the carbon offsets you can use to offset your regulatory or compliance requirements. Whereas in Australia, I think there's a good flow between these two markets. So when we look at carbon markets, I want to sort of pick up on the demand side first. And if you look at the initial start of the markets in 2014, the government played a really key role in acquiring a lot of the ACCUs in the market. So if you can see from the start over here, the light green bar represents government purchases from 2014 onwards. And this sort of really culminated into a period where I think there have been about 15 auctions over the last 2015 to 2023 period, which culminated into about close to 244 million ACCUs, which have been sold to the Australian government, worth about 2.7 billion, or committed to the Australian government. So it's played a key role, but if you look at the years coming closer to 2024, you can see that the role of the government has diminished. And in general, I think this is where we found that the compliance markets, like the safeguard mechanism, as you'll see from the next slide, have started to pick up on a lot more ACCUs from the market. So this is the demand profile, which builds up from the previous slide. If you look at the red bars over here, these are the safeguard mechanism demand centers that have bought ACCUs. I think in 2024, just last year, demand from the safeguard mechanism hit about 1.5 million ACCUs, compared to the previous year in 2023, where it was only something like 236,000. The next big consumption area is the voluntary market, which is relatively steady. If you look at this dark blue bar over here, in 2024, demand was about 1 million ACCUs, compared to 2023, where it was about 1.2 million tons. The rest of the profile from the demand side, you can see the gray bars here. These are what we call compliance demand. Basically, these are private sector purchases of ACCUs to meet their contractual obligations with either municipal or state level contracts. And the blue bar would be government demand. On the supply side, so typically when we look at voluntary markets, the generation of carbon credits are defined by their methodologies. And under the ACCU scheme, we have about 30 different approved methods available or methodologies which generate ACCUs in the market. Primarily, a lot of these ACCUs are in the environmental or nature-based solutions, in forestry, and in landfill gas. So typically, the biggest volumes are, let's say, under the vegetation and landfill and waste groups. And if you look at the breakdown in this slide, you'll find that the majority of ACCUs in Australia are generated by three major groups. So you've got the light blue, which is primarily what we call the vegetation methods. So this includes afforestation, reforestation, blue carbon, and replantings. If you look at the next biggest group, which will be the red section, which is primarily waste sector. So if you look at landfill gas, for example, a lot of our credits are generated from the sector. And the last one in the orange sector would be fire management methods. So if you delve a bit more into the waste management side, this is strongly related to the bioenergy sector. We can actually broadly categorize it into three key areas. The first one will be around landfill gas method, which is essentially the capture of methane from landfills. The second one would be energy generation, to your point about creating electricity. This is probably the largest type of projects that generate ACCUs. About 19% or about 29 million ACCUs were generated in 2024. And the last but not least was around the recycling of waste materials. So out of the 151 million ACCUs that were created in 2024, 37 million of those ACCUs were generated from the bioenergy sector. These are some of the challenges that are faced at this point in time. So out of the 19 of the 30 methods that are in this space, some of them are coming under review in terms of their methodologies. The expectation is that for landfill gas methods, there will be stricter baselines potentially, which could actually reduce the amount of ACCUs that are generated from these projects. The second key challenge really is the competition for feedstock. So when you think about biomass and availability of biomass and competing sectors like transportation, there will be a lot more focus on getting those feedstocks. In terms of biomethane, I think there are certain incentives that can be introduced to drive more adoption. In the case of biomethane, let's say for the greenhouse gas reporting protocols, biomethane still isn't included as part of the benefits. In terms of agricultural waste, it's a core part of the feedstocks available for biogas and bioenergy. Unfortunately, that hasn't been incorporated into the ACCUs methodology as yet. The other part which is actually going to potentially could impact ACCUs would be the issuances of SMCs. I'm sorry, running out of time, but recently there have been a surge in issuances of SMCs which could impact ACCUs demand. And last but not least, impact from potential political shifts. So I just wanted to touch on what we do at Argus. We cover environmental commodities, both compliance markets and voluntary markets globally, which includes the big benchmarks like EUAs, China CEAs, and also the US-based benchmarks like REGIs and CCAs in terms of compliance markets. And in terms of Australia, we will be launching coverage both on generic ACCUs and also HIR as well. So, and that, thank you very much for listening. And if you've got any questions, please let me know.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. We do have around just over 10 minutes for questions. So we have our team here with microphones. As our speakers come up to the stage, would anyone like to ask a question? I can see a question up the back there.
Hi everyone, it's Sophie from Department of Energy in Victoria. I have a question for the last speaker. It wasn't Steve Tan, but yeah, that's your name, great. It was around the methods of the landfill gas. You said that the revised landfill gas methods will likely lead to lower supplies. What do you mean lower supplies? Like lower supplies of energy or lower supplies of...
From what I understand, the baseline issuance of credits from some of these projects will be a lot stricter. So the review will probably look at how many credits each project can generate, and that would reduce the amount of ACCUs that can be generated from each project. That was my read of it. I hope that helps, but I can come back to you with a bit more detail.
Annette Cowie, New South Wales GPI RD. Along those lines, you had the wastewater treatment meth review on your list as well, but you didn't mention it. What are you anticipating as the outcome of that review?
Sorry, was that for me? Could you please repeat the question?
On your slide about methods being reviewed under the ACCU scheme, you mentioned the landfill gas, but you also had the wastewater treatment meth on your list. And I was wondering if you have an expectation of the outcome of that review, like whether that meth will be withdrawn altogether or revised in some manner.
It's a great question. That means I can't answer it, so I'll take it back to my colleague. Please see me after the session.
This one's for Emily. So I really appreciated your frank opinions, and so thanks. So for, I guess this is for Anita as well, and for all of us that are embarking now on an Australian system under the go, like any advice for us on just how to like unpack all of this, you know, it's very technical, all of these different models, and even in the US there's various versions, and like is there a simple way or a resource that you can recommend for all of us that really kind of unpacks the history of that sort of technical development in the different markets, or is that just wishful thinking?
I wouldn't say it's wishful thinking. I don't really know in terms of specific for Australia. But I would say it's worth talking with academia and seeing who is kind of doing research out there currently in Australia. But there are other, you know, I mentioned the GREET model for the US anyways. That has been one that we point to quite a bit. And so that is through our Department of Energy. So it also may be worth talking to various government institutions on it. Or even talking with the folks, and happy to connect you with over at GREET to see what they may already have on Australia, since it is something that's being looked at quite a bit, more globally than specific to Australia. I think just generally it's understanding where your benefits are, right? So if you want your own modeling, look to who you trust to give you that economic kind of understanding for modeling and bringing folks in. But otherwise, I think that would be the biggest, easiest way to unpack things, is just kind of looking inward, and then, of course, using things as education to move forward with them.
I might ask a question off the side directed to Anita from that, which is one of the slides that Emily used showed the change across time depending on the processes and technologies that were available and being used. As we do establish the frameworks for the GO scheme, will there be a way to modify them across time reasonably rapidly, or to recognise differences?
There definitely will be. We'll be reviewing. There'll be a review protocol for all of the methodologies as we work. You know, we'll be rolling out a range of different product methodologies over the next few years, and then also a review program over the top of that as industry evolves and best available knowledge, and we learn as we go as well what is working for us, we can take that all on board. And definitely. I can't comment on a time frame as to how long that will take. It will come down to machineries of government and things like that, and how long the government can actually, how quickly the government can respond. But we'll endeavour to do it as quickly as possible to respond to the changing situations.
Thank you.
Me? Hey, I'm Philippa from Gemini. I have a question for you, Anita. In terms of the product Go, you mentioned that it can track hydrogen, let's start there, through infrastructure, including pipelines. From what I understand, the PGO can be decoupled so the certificate decoupled from the electron, but the REGO can, but the PGO can't be decoupled. So you actually have to trace that molecule, which through infrastructure is effectively, it can't be done. So you can't actually trace it through to its end user. So I just wanted to know, the intent seems like it should be able to be used in gas infrastructure, but right now, as we understand it, it can't be. Is the department looking to change that?
Right now, there is provision in the Act for hydrogen to be blended into a gas pipeline. Okay. And then, so while there will be multiple consumers using that shared infrastructure, so there's no one single consumer endpoint, but the Act will provide for differing circumstances of who might be identified as a consumer. It could be a retailer, or it could be a range of individual consumers wishing to identify as a consumer on the PGO certificate so that they can claim that credit. So there is provision for that in the Act now. So, yeah. Is that helpful?
I've got a question down the front.
That was a maybe back.
Maybe just while we wait there, Billy Priest from Marthaler. Just another question for Anita. Anita, it sounds like quite a detailed consultation process. Is there a view to make a jurisdiction as a baseline, an alternative jurisdiction that's established and more mature as a baseline for consideration, and then alterations as required?
Do you mean adopting another jurisdiction's methodology, carbon accounting methodology for a product?
At least as a starting point, having a look at another jurisdiction and saying, why does that not work for us, versus bottom up, let's see what works for us.
So part of the requirements are in the Act that we align with international standards where it suits the Australian situation. So we'll be considering a range of different jurisdiction approaches and considering them in the Australian context and adjusting where we need to so that it suits Australian circumstances. And we'll be consulting with you guys on that process as well and what you think will work for your situations.
Yep.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Maria. I run two companies. First of all, we are still identifying if plastics that is converted to diesel is still bio or green. And another company, we are providing the additive to a diesel fuel that is accredited by Clean Energy Regulator, and you can apply for carbon credits. My question will be probably to Anita. If we know in Australia that there is a product that can help us with the diesel, with the or petrol, with existing fuel, while we are developing the biofuel, strategies and biofuel in general, are there any consequences for companies that will not be applying any helpful product to decrease their emissions? It doesn't make sense what I just asked.
Well, the GO scheme is voluntary. It doesn't set a standard on emissions. It just provides an emissions intensity measure of the product. So goes agnostic as far as technology or fuel types and blends or things like that. As long as we've got a production pathway that there's a method for in the legislation, you can apply and get a GO certificate. What that emissions intensity is depends on the individual circumstances, but we won't be setting any thresholds or standards on. I'm not sure.
I'm just like, from the perspective, we know that there is a solution that exists and, approved by the government, but for some reason not everybody's still using it. So like, I'm just trying to understand if it's something that we should look into or like apply as mandatory, or like, what is your perspective on that?
I can't really comment on to whether there should be a policy or mandate or anything like that. The GO scheme itself won't be setting anything mandatory or a standard to try and deal with that sort of a situation.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
Yeah, there's a question up the back.
Hopefully for someone else.
I'll go one for Tim, just...
Hello, I'm Ketty from Jet Zero. I was just, so I think Emily and Anita are probably targeted for this, but I know some of the global methodologies have defaults and then the potential to do actual LCA calculations. I'm curious to get your thoughts on when you think it will be predominantly actual methodology calculations rather than default, and maybe how quickly.
That's an interesting question. I don't know about a timeline, but I would say part of the problem with having with a default versus the actual values, sometimes those actual values, because of the traceability requirements, are very difficult to obtain, or it's very onerous on the producers to put that information in there. So I think partially sometimes you'll see those defaults being maybe an outsized of importance, but that's just because the pathway to individual values is much more difficult. And I think that's what you see with say, Corsia, you see it with Brazil's Renova Bio, and those default scores are really the only way to move forward with some of those requirements, unfortunately. So I think it's hard to put a timeline on that, other than saying if they make it easier for producers to comply. And that gets back to this idea that, farmers are all small businesses, right? Or maybe large businesses, depend on how you want to classify it. So having that information is very difficult and sometimes challenging, both in terms of that business proprietariness and just the ability to trace back something. When you talk about the molecule, you talked about the molecule for hydrogen, it's very difficult to go back through the system. It's also very difficult to find that ear of corn or that gallon of jet fuel. So that's partially why it's going to always have that difficulty to have those actual values.
Thank you for that. I don't know if you'll just answer very briefly. We're at 5:15.
As far as the GO scheme is concerned, we're looking at options to allow for both default factors as well as bespoke factors for particular situations. So we're still considering options and seeing how that will work out and play. Later in the year, when we release the hydrogen methodology determination, that will likely have the approach taken for hydrogen with regard to that default versus bespoke situation, and you'll be able to have a look and give us your feedback.
Thank you. Through those conversations, you can see there will be a lot of consultation across the year with the federal government, both around the GO scheme and also a range of those carbon credit methods. Bioenergy Australia is, of course, our wonderful advocate here, so please work and support them on those consultations. I'd like you to offer a big thanks to all our speakers, please.
Thank you. And that is the end of day 2. So for everybody who is able to make it back tomorrow, looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. And thanks again to Tiana and the panel. and all of our international speakers that have come so far. And good luck to anyone who is not yet on their pathway home to Brisbane or Northern Rivers. Wishing you all the absolute best. Look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.